Today is May the 11th, 2009. My name is Tanya Finchum. I'm with Oklahoma State University Library, and we're conducting a World History project titled Centennial Farms. And we're here in Davenport, Oklahoma with Romeyn Ninness.
Right.
So thank you for joining us today. Let's start by having you tell a little bit how your family came to have the land that we're going to visit today.
Well, my family came to ownership of this property by the run of 1989 by my great-grandfather, Israel Royer, I believe was his whole name. And that's how they got it, was through the run, and it's been handed down. Israeli had 3 sons, which he would have left it to, except one of them passed in Wyoming in a rodeo accident or something of that nature, and the other one he went off to Oregon and didn't want any part of the farm. So my grandfather, Grover Royer, wound up with the farm, which due to a divorce was split, so he got 80 acres and his wife got 80 acres, and mother got his 80 acres, and now I have possession of that 80 acres. Okay. So.
And where did the original one come from? What state? Kansas, Missouri, or where?
I think they come from Missouri, I believe. At least the Heron side did, I'm pretty sure. Okay. Which was my grandmother's name, Grandma Royer.
And the name of the farm is?
Just the Ninness Farm, I guess, or the Royer Farm. It has no special name.
Okay, I just wondered, when you had your sign made for the Centennial, what did you call it on your paper?
The Israel Royer family farm, I guess.
Okay.
We'll have to look at the sign out there to correct that. I really paid no attention.
Well, we'll take a look then.
Yeah.
Okay, so you got it from your mother. Your mother got it from her father. And then your father
got it from
his great. Did you have siblings, or were you the only one that chose to stay on the farm?
Yeah, I had 2 brothers and 1 sister, although the sister passed away when she was 2 years old. And the youngest brother was a special needs child, and so he spent his life at Billings. And my older brother he didn't want to settle back down here, so I wound up with the farm, which I always wanted it anyway. So. Well,
then, did your mother had siblings, right? Your brothers and sisters.
Yes.
And they didn't want it.
Well, as I said, Grandma and Grandpa got divorced,
right.
And the one brother that she had got my grandma's side. Okay. And my mother gave her side to me because the sister is in Alaska and has been there for years and years. And prior to that, she was in California. She went to Alaska prior to it becoming a state. So she's been there since '59.
So what were the early crops that the farm produced?
Well, during Grandpa Royer's day, he raised corn and cotton and mainly sweet potatoes. He was known as the sweet potato king, at least in Lincoln County. There used to be about a 40 by, I'm going to say 80 or so feet, that he had dug a hole and made a basement floor, and it had, each floor had, I think it was 30 bins in it, and then there was 2 floors above ground that had the same amount of bins. And there were times when all those bins were full. They held, I think Mother said, 100 bushel. So he used to raise a lot of sweet potatoes. I know at one time there, and still is as far as this water tank goes, he set up an old boiler and cemented it on the ground to hold water, and he put out little irrigation lines in the ground and in his sweet potato hotbeds, and he fertilized those with horse manure, which he had plenty of it back in those days, to create heat to make the sweet potato plants grow better. And they had glass coverings. They were wooden frames on the ground with glass coverings on them. And he would get out at the proper time of the year and put sweet potatoes out there and grow slips, and then he'd take the slips and transplant them into the ground. And he was quite an ingenious inventor himself. The story has been told that he made the first metal plow, and he used it on that farm, and he talked to, I don't know whether it was John Deere or the international people back at that time about maybe manufacturing it, and they came and looked at it, but they didn't sign no papers or anything, and the next thing you know, there's a metal plow on the market. So whether he initially discovered and built the metal plow, I have no way of knowing for sure, but that's the story that's told. And he also made a sled that he pulled behind a horse for people to sit on, and they would stick the sweet potato plants in the ground as the horse walked down the road to plant sweet potatoes, to keep you from having to crawl along the row and put them in the ground. So he devised a planting system for his sweet potatoes as well.
And this would have been in the early 1900s, or?
Oh yeah, in the 20s and 30s, back during that period of time, because we came there in 46. This sweet potato house that I mentioned had already, I think it got struck by lightning and burned up, and it was full of sweet potatoes. So he gave away a lot of baked sweet potatoes back during that time. They used to be several, of course back then we called them Negroes, and that's not a derogatory term as far as I'm concerned, because that's the way I grew up for that era. But there was lots of Negroes out in that area, and they would come by and visit with Grandma and Grandpa, and usually walk off with a sack full of sweet potatoes, because they'd just give them to them. You know, they were, I won't say indigent people, but they didn't have much, just like Grandma and Grandpa didn't have much. You know, you got what you could get to subsist on, and Grandma and Grandpa had plenty of sweet potatoes, so they shared. And I've worked with colored people all my life and sat down to a meal with them, and they're pretty smart people if you really get to know them. You know, they have lots of good ideas. So.
Well, did they have other produce on the garden, like a garden to do other foods during that time?
Well, Grandpa was a great one for planting of trees and etc. He loved pecans. If you was to talk to certain people in the area, you would find that if they have a pecan tree on their place, that Grandpa Royer may have grafted it. There used to be this flat top block house, cement block house. It's just out of 66, Davenport on Highway 66. It was owned by a guy we call Shorty Taylor, and this happened back around late 40s or early 50s. Grandpa was going to Chandler one day, and he just stopped and went out there with this guy's little pecan tree. It was just starting to grow, and started chopping limbs off of it and putting grafts on it. Didn't ask him. And Shorty's told me this story. So he said, I seen this guy out there cutting limbs off of my tree. He said, I didn't know the guy from Adam, you know. So I went out and I said, what in the world you doing to my pecan tree? And he said, Grandpa told him, well, I'm putting some decent pecans on it. He said, I'm grafting it for you. And after talking with him a little, Shorty was kind of mad to start with, but after talking with him some, he said, well, okay, go ahead and finish up what you're doing. And so Grandpa put 2 different pecans on that tree, and I don't think the tree is still there, because I believe it was cut down after Shorty died about 10 years ago. But up until that time, it was still producing pecans. 2 different varieties. I don't know what kind of varieties they were, because I never did check it, but Grandpa grafted them, and he grafted pecans all over this county, and he planted apple trees all over. We used to have a big apple orchard out there. When we first moved there in '46, there was probably 50 apple trees, and we would gather apples and take to town and sell them. And that was one of the things that we did to make a living, which today you just can't do. You know, there's so much, I guess, FDA regulations that we started milking cows and separating milk and taking the cream to town and selling. And we had lots of chickens, and we'd gather eggs and take them uptown and sell them and trade for groceries, and you know, just first one thing and then another. But the main crops out there, I guess you'd say, were in Grandpa's time was corn and cotton and pecans, which they have lots of pecan trees. Now there's been so much salt water come down across the place that a lot of the pecan trees have died. And then this ice storm we had last year damaged a whole bunch. When we go out there, you'll see still some of the devastation, because I've just not been able to get it all cleaned up. I've been working on it some when I feel like it, but there's still lots to be done. And other than for that, and the sweet potatoes in his time is all I know that they grew. Well, they made sorghum. He used to have a sorghum mill that sat right down next to the road, and they'd go grow that old cane sorghum, and they'd cut it, and then he had as I say, a mill which the old horse walked around and around, you know, grinding or smashing the syrup out of the cane. And they had vats that they'd boil it, and Mother'd talk about skimming that old green slime off the top of it, you know, because the stuff's green when you first start. Then after you boil it a while and I guess scorch it, it turns brown, you know. But anyway, because I've never made sorghum, so I don't know the process on it, but they used to make sorghum a lot and sell the sorghum uptown and around. Grandpa was quite a peddler in his day as well. They grew tomatoes as well and peddled tomatoes, and at one time the pecans and stuff were not selling here, and he came up with the idea, well, I'll just take some out east. So he loaded up a couple of 1,000 pounds of pecans and put them on his old truck and took a trip out to Chicago and sold the majority of them, I guess. This was during the Depression time and just after. But anyway, there was 2 sharecroppers, or 2 houses for sharecroppers on the place. During 29s and 30s, Dad worked for the Gulf Oil Company down at Seminole and in that area. And of course, during the 29s and 30s, early 30s, he was out of work. There just wasn't any jobs to be had. And so they came up with his new wife, because he got married in 30, and to Mother, and they lived in one of the houses, and he grew cotton and corn, and I don't much think they were growing peanuts at that time. We grew peanuts after we came there, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But these houses that they lived in were the old shake boards, I think you call them, or plank boards anyway. They were just a 2x4 at the bottom and a 2x4 at the top, and 1x12s nailed in between, and some bracing, and then covered with a heavy cardboard paper inside to keep the wind from blowing through. And paper was nailed up with big old quarter-size washers that, of course, were manufactured during that time, and big-headed tar paper tacks, and they'd nail them up and hold the cardboard paper up that way. And they used the big washers so it wouldn't tear through as easily. And of course that paper had designs on it just like wallpaper today. And that's how they survived in their little old throw-up house, you know. And there was 2 of those, and Grandpa usually always had at least one sharecropper on the place. Of course, during the hard times of the Depression, both he and my dad and his son, Mother's brother, lived there in the family in one house and Mother and Dad in the other. And then the boy built a house they gave him, I think it was 5 acres at that time, and he built a house up on the North 80, and then him and his wife moved up there. Their house was built, I think, somewhere around 34 or 35, and it's still there, although it's been added to and changed some. But
that was during the Depression too, then.
Yes, yeah, it was. And then in 46, in 43, it was either 41 or 43, Grandma and Grandpa anyway went to Oregon, and they went out there in California and Oregon, that area. They went to both places. Grandpa had a brother that lived in Oregon, so they went out there with him and to try to make better living, because they went out and he panned a little gold, and they shot bears and stuff like that. In fact, he brought some bear meat back with him when he came. And it's not half bad eating, but Grandma didn't like it out there, so she came back to Oklahoma, and that's what caused the divorce, because Grandpa stayed out there and she came back here, and things just didn't work out for them, so they got a divorce. And then after Grandpa remarried twice, I think, during that time, and then he came back to Oklahoma to stay in, must have been around 70, 75, somewhere in there. And him and Grandma got remarried. So they lived in Stroud until both of them passed away. And then in 46, when Dad came up, he lost his job again after the war for all time. They did offer to send him back to Illinois and keep him employed, but he said he is from Illinois, although he was born here in Oklahoma, over on Salt Creek, I think it's called, by Stroud. And he stayed here for 7 years, and then they went back to Illinois. He was born in 1907, just after Oklahoma became a state. And they went back to Illinois, and then he came back out here in either 28 or 29. Mother can tell you for sure. And he married Mother in 1930. He had a cousin that lived on the northwest corner of where this pyramid is on what used to be the old 66 road. That pyramid, though, it has something to do, I can't never remember, it has something to do with some sort of a trail. That's why it was put up there. But it also became a monument marker for 66 because it would come out of Stroud on a road that is about a half a mile south of what is now 66, and turned south, and then came about a quarter of a mile, then turned back west and came into what is now 66, and in that curve over there. And let me recalculate where I was at here. I forgot where I was at in my story.
I can ask you a question. We can back up just a little bit. You said your grandfather grafted?
Yeah.
How did he learn how to do that?
Just self-taught. He heard about it or something, and I don't really know. He was an avid reader of newspapers and things, so he may have read about it. It could be that he even got a pamphlet from OSU. I don't know, and learned about it. But because he did read avidly about farming and stuff. He was one of, I guess, the first. He was a forward-thinking person, really. During the WPA, which I guess, again, was during the Depression times. He let them come in, and the WPA put water spills in the gullies that had washed on the farm, and they're still in the ground there today, especially up on the section that my uncle had. They're just made out of old sand rock and stacked in there for the water to spill over and to keep from washing out, but they did their job, and it's filled in, the gullies are, and you can't hardly see them or find them now unless you run into them with a plow or something. And he had the farm terraced and all that sort of thing, and they built the old schoolhouse half a mile south of them, which was the North Slope School. And my mother drew a picture of Woodrow Wilson on a white diamond stone, and it was planted in the eave of the schoolhouse when they built it, and so that was her contribution, I guess, to that period of time. And but that wasn't on our farm. It was later because Dad bought it when we moved up here, but then he sold it later. And so.
Did you go to school there, or was it?
No, Mother did, and both of her, all the other three siblings all went there. But it was just a 8th grade school. After the 8th grade, they would go to Stroud. And of course there was no buses, so Mother, at the age of about 14, started driving the old Model T truck to Stroud to go to school. And of course, back then there wasn't any license required. You just get in the vehicle and go. And that's how she met Dad. I think I was getting to that part of the story when his cousin owned that property north and west of that pyramid. And on that curve, they had a grocery store and gas station. And they were sitting out on the porch one morning when Mother drove by going to school, and Dad said, "Man, that's a good-looking girl," And so anyway, they got introduced, and mother says, he's the guy I'm going to marry. She said, I let him chase me for 3 years before he got to marry me. So anyway, that's her story that I've heard her tell. And that's how they met, really. I mean, at that store. Because they'd stop there for gas and buy groceries and whatnot. And another thing that Grandpa did, and this was 29s and 30s, I don't know how the man was so smart and knew all this stuff. Like I say, he read a lot though. He built a boiler next to the pond, and he would go around to these new oil wells that they had. And of course, back then, drip was the thing they just threw away. And he collected drip and run it through this boiler and refined the tar out of it and made gasoline. And he sold gas to all the stations around in Stroud and Chandler and Depew and even up to Bristow and Kendrick for a nickel a gallon. And then they in turn resold it for 8, 10 cents. And of course it was all white type gas. And if you wanted leaded gas, they just put a red coloring in it and sold that. At least that's how I was told. And he furnished a lot of gas to the county free of charge just to keep the roads graded out there, because there was no gravel on the roads back then, and people kept the fence rows cleaned out, as back in that time they had what they called a poll tax, and so the farmers along the way to pay their taxes kept the roadways clean and in a lot of cases graded. And then they the county started maintaining the roads, and so here that done away with the farmer having to do it, and the farmer had to start paying taxes to the county then because he wasn't working off his taxes. And another way that Grandpa and Dad and Marcellus, which is now gone, made a living during that time was, I think it was again a WPA project, because the old 66 road used to come out of Prague and exit, and instead of making that big curve down there where it does now, not 66, I'm sorry, 99, came up straight from that curve through, didn't come through Sparks, I don't think, but it came close to, and crossed the Deep Fork River down there on what is Brown's property, and right straight on past up our farm and on up and into Stroud, and Old Stroud, which was about 3 miles or 4 miles west of the now Stroud. And so when they moved 99 over to where it is now, they had it there for a while, but it was almost like having to ford the river. There was no bridge, and because the river usually was pretty low, and they just had some rock and stuff in there to drive over. Well, during the rains and everything, people were getting stuck so much they finally decided to build a bridge. In fact, Dad used to tell a story before they built the bridge. He said he'd come up from Seminole to see Mother every weekend, and going back he got stuck, and of course they had old man had a team there to pull people out, and he would charge everybody a quarter. And Dad said, "Come on and pull me out." He said, "No, not unless you got a quarter." Dad said, "Well, thunder," he said, "I'll just sit here and wait till that bus comes in about 30 minutes. He said, "You charge him $1.50 to pull him through." And he said, "You can't get him through until you get me out." So he said, "I'll just sit here and wait." And finally the bus came, and the old man pulled him out and on through the hot water hole, and then he pulled the bus through. So that was one of Dad's means of saving money, I guess, during that time, because he didn't have any. But they built that bridge, and Grandpa and Daddy and, as I said, his son worked over there with their horses and a couple of slips and moving dirt to make the levee to build the bridge on. And the irony of it is I think the men were getting either 25 or 50 cents a day, but the horses, they were getting 75 cents, and a team was getting $1.50. And Grandpa had 3 teams over there, so he was making pretty good money back then, and then each one of the workers was getting either a quarter or a half a dollar. But I always thought it was kind of odd that them horses was worth more money than what the men were, you know. But they helped build that levee and put that bridge in. This was back in the 30s sometime, and either the 20s or 30s. And anyhow, that's they did that as part of a livelihood during that time. And then, as I say, Daddy came up, and we in '46, the old brick house that we lived in was in pretty much disarray, and so we moved into a house a mile north of the farm, which was the old Miller place, and lived in a real nice wood structure, 2-story, just 4 rooms. But we had wood cook stove and oil and wood heat, and that's how we spent that year while we worked on the old brick house, getting it ready to move into. And then we moved back into it in late '46, and lived there until the folks felt it was falling down. The ends were pulling away from the walls, the east and west walls, and Dad had tied them together with sucker rod and grater blades to hold the walls from falling down. But in must have been '65, they moved some more houses in front of the old brick house, and put a room in between to tie the two together. They had a large two old houses and a room in between, so they had a large house to live in, as well as the old brick house. And then it's been about 7 years ago, I guess, 8 maybe, that lightning hit one of the other houses. Daddy was staying in here with us, and Mother was in the hospital up at Tulsa, luckily, because it evidently got hit by lightning. It was a bad stormy night, and everything burned up, both the old wood houses and the brick house. So all there is left standing is just the north 2 corners of the old brick house. Everything else has fell down. Thousands of dollars worth of antiques went up in smoke because Mother saved everything she had. We had an old Wilson or Woodrow Wilson, I can't remember what they call them, the kitchen cupboard cabinet, where you had the old sugar bin and the flour bin and the pull-out. We had one of those in there. We had wood stoves and kerosene stoves and oak buffets, and you name it, it was there. We had one of the old stick-it-in-the-ground jobber corn planters where you operate handles like a post hole digger. We had one of those, and had butter churns and corn cob shellers, and you name it, she had it. And all that's gone due to the fires. So, and I don't know what else. When Dad and us kids started farming, it was pecans again. And we raised the cotton for the first couple of years, and that was just too much process of work. And of course, cotton was getting cheaper in price, and cotton was ruining the land as well. And took lots of fertilizer to try to get a decent crop. I know our last cotton that we raised, it probably wasn't 8 inches tall, but it had 2-3 bolts on it, but you broke your back going down through there trying to pull them. And hoe cotton, I never got so tired of hoeing cotton as a kid. I wanted to just take my hoe and chop it all down, but I knew if I did, I'd get my butt busted, so I kept hoeing the weeds instead of getting rid of the cotton, you know. And of course, Dad was a stickler for doing things right. He had us, me and my brother, putting in a fence because we had cattle, and as I said earlier, that we milked about 13 or 15 head we'd milk, and we'd take the milk and separate it and sell the cream. So since you got cattle, you got to have a fence, and Dad decided to put about a 1/4 of a mile fence up. And of course, my brother, being older than me, he was always the boss, you know. And Dad said, put that fence up and make dang sure it's straight. So I was pretty good at sighting fences, but Jack didn't want to wait while I would walk back and eyeball the post in line, you know. He'd just go ahead and throw it in the hole and tamp it in. Well, Dad come home that night, went out and looked at that fence, and he said, you boys just get out there in the morning and tear that fence out. And he said, this time, put it in straight. He said, I told you to do it right the first time. And so the next day, we rebuilt the fence again. And this time, Jack said, okay, go line it up. And so this time, we got the fence built straight. But we raised pecans and peanuts, several acres of peanuts, and wheat and barley and corn and anything that would feed the cows and the hogs. At one time, as an agriculture boy, I was involved with Berkshire hogs. I loved Berkshires. That's all I raised. And at one time, we had about 100 piglets and mama cows or mama hogs on the farm, and it was kind of a drouthy year, and all my little pigs got dust pneumonia from so much dust. We'd get out and throw buckets of water in the pens and stuff, trying to keep the ground wet to where the dust, but they'd get that dust in their nose and it'd go into their lungs and they couldn't breathe. I lost all my piglets but about 20. And so that was a bad year for me. But I quit raising hogs and got me some registered whiteface and during my high school years, and raised those and did all right.
Which is what?
I'm sorry?
Which is what? Whiteface.
Whiteface, that's a cow,
Okay.
a beef animal. Yeah, and so that went along with the dairy portion of milking the cows. And in the 51, we started building a dairy because it was getting to where you couldn't take milk to town and sell it and sell your cream anymore. That I guess was due to the FDA starting to crack down on diseases and whatnot. And after in about 3 years, you couldn't take cream to town and sell it anymore. So Dad started selling cream and milk to Borden's up here in Oklahoma City. They had a truck that would come by and pick it up. We sold it in 10-gallon milk cans and cream cans. And they would send us a check, I guess, about every 2 weeks for what we sent up there. And he raised peanuts to sell and would bale the peanut tops for hay to feed the cows. And then, of course, due to our, I can't think of what they called it, the people that say you can grow this much of whatever, and they come out and said you can't grow but 3 acres of peanuts anymore. You're growing too much. And so Dad said, okay. And we only grew about 5 to 6 acres anyhow. But he put them in on 32-inch rows, I guess, whatever our planter was set for. And so to get around the cutback in the allotment, he went down to Sears and bought him a little walking garden tractor, and he planted his peanuts with that garden tractor instead of the big tractor planter. And so we had about 3 times the amount of rows on 3 acres instead of the same amount of rows on 6 acres. And so he managed to grow about the same amount of crop, even though they had told him he had to grow less. And Dad wouldn't never fool with them people much, because he didn't like to take subsidies and handouts from people. And one of them came out one time and told him, he said, you've got to plow up them 4 acres of wheat you got out there. And Dad said, there ain't no wheat on this farm. And the guy said, yes, there is, right out there. And Dad said, I'll tell you what, you see that lane? He said, you get out there in it. And he said, you get off this place. He said, you have no business even doing what you're doing. He said, that ain't wheat, that's barley. And he said, it don't have to be plowed up. And he said, I'm raising that for my hogs. And he said, I'm going to keep raising it. So he chased the guy off anyway. He had no business for, I can't think of the name that they call them people. They're in the courthouse over there. But anyway, they regulated the crops.
Not the extension? County extension?
County extension agent,
Does that sound right?
That's who does it, yeah. But anyhow, he had no use for them. And we eventually went from growing any kind of crops to just growing millet and oats and anything to make hay with. We'd raise hay and sell it. Of course, we always had some beef cattle on the place, and 1 or 2 old milk cows for the milk for the family, and raising pecans. And of course, when I was a kid, it was take a frail pole and go down and knock them out of the tree and climb up the tree and to where you could reach them, the ones in the top, and every once in a while you'd almost fall out. And then they came out with these automatic pickers and shakers and cleaners. And so in '65 we got us a picker and a cleaner off of the guy that Dad had worked for across the road from us, and he sold his cleaner that he had and got him a bigger, faster one, and Dad just bought it because his used one would do the job for him. And I still have it sitting out there in the barn. And we have an old shaker that we clamp onto the trees and shake them out. And it used to take me and Dad and Mother all day to go down and frail pecans on sheets. And we'd gather them up and put them in tubs and sacks and take them up to the house and clean through them at night time to get all the trash out and just the pecans to sell. And now it's about 300 pounds a day. Back then was all we could gather, and now I can go out and shake about 30 trees in 15 or 20 minutes and gather all 30 of them in about 2 hours. And I pick about anywhere from, depending on the crop on the tree, I'll pick anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 pounds a day. You know, I mean, it's so much faster and simpler now. Since I clean my own pecans and it's an old cleaner and slow, I can only pick so much trash at one time. So I may have to run one sack of pecans 3 or 4 times to get all the trash out of it. So the cleaning of them is a big thing for me, but I don't even mess with much anymore, so that stuff is all gone by the wayside, really. And that's about all I can think of, unless you've got some more specific questions you'd like to ask.
Well, the first one comes to mind. You work. What'd you do for fun?
We didn't have any fun. I guess that was one of the things. I don't know why I loved farming when I hated it as a kid. We didn't have no Thanksgiving. We had Thanksgivings and Christmases, but you didn't know it as a holiday, really. I mean, I've eaten many a Thanksgiving dinner in the pecan grove, gathering pecans. Mother would bring the food down about 11 o'clock, and we'd stop and eat dinner, and an hour and a half or so later, we were back to gathering pecans. And on Christmas Day, many has been the time that we'd get up in the morning and have our Christmas and open presents and whatnot. And if we were lucky, we'd get to have Christmas dinner before going to the pecan grove. But we were usually always in the pecan grove by 1 or 1:30 and gathering pecans until chore time. And even sometimes in the morning time we would go and have Christmas dinner in the pecan grove. It depended upon the pecan crop, how much there was and how badly we needed to get it out, and the weather. If we were expecting a lot of overflows and things, we worked the bottom land first to get the pecans up, because if you didn't, when it overflowed, they were gone down the creek and somebody else got them. We would usually get to go hunting on Thanksgiving Day occasionally and on Christmas Day, because we'd have relatives come in, and Grandpa Royer was still alive during that time, and he loved to hunt, and it was Mother's cousins that would come down. Her mother's brother's boys would come down and hunt with us, and they loved Grandpa Royer and hunting on the farm. And so, because we had back then, I mean, nobody cared about you going out and hunting on them. The more squirrels and rabbits and stuff you killed, the better they liked it. And of course now you can't hardly get on anybody's property to hunt anything unless they really know you. And but we used to hunt that whole Deep Fork bottom and Dry Creek bottoms when I was a kid, and we lived on the meat and whatnot that we harvested that way. But
well, what did the farm do for water? Did it have a creek through it?
well,
ponds?
it has a creek, kind of a slough through, but Grandpa had built a pond in one of the gullies, and it stayed good and full up until about 3 years ago. And I guess we plowed the ground in such a way that the water doesn't run into it anymore or something. But it'll stay about half full. But as far as house water, that well is a hand-dug well, and it's about, when it was first made, it was about 38 to 40 feet deep, and it has a white rock in the bottom of it. And then Grandpa, my grandpa, he made some cement cistern-looking pipes, and he sat them down in the well to keep the walls from falling in. It used to just be a stacked rock on top of rock, and that all started falling in, so he made these cement cistern pipes, like your big water culverts that go under the highways. They were about 3 foot across, with a lip formed into them to fit one inside the other. And he set those in there and went down, as he said, stack them on top and then clean out from under them and let them settle. And he redid the well that way to keep it from falling in, and cleaned it out. And it's not a vast water producer, many gallons. It will produce a lot of water and always has produced water, but being on top of the hill like we are, you wonder how it manages. And it takes about 45 minutes at full volume of a water faucet to pump it dry, and that's in a pretty good seasonal water availability time. In I think it was 49 or 50, we had about 100 head of cattle that we were milking and whatnot at that time, and the creeks all dried up. We had no water in the ponds or anything. I mean, there just was no water around. We had a terrible drought, and we ran that cow tank 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with a stream of water just a little bit smaller than a pencil. And we kept that 100 head of cattle watered, because that water tank, it's probably 350 gallon. It would fill up, and they'd come up, and of course cows have got a pecking order. They got a boss and a less senior boss, and so on. The boss got to drink first, and then they just kept stepping up to the tank until they all got watered. And when they got finished, there probably wouldn't be 3 inches of water in the bottom of that tank. But by the time they wanted another drink, it would be back full, and it just kept the process going. And like I say, it was never shut off for probably a good 4 months. But that water well never went dry, and supplied water to the house. And so it's a pretty good well as far as continuous water. And it was good water, at least back when it was first made. And it's still not bad water, but it tastes a little salty sometimes. I think all this dang salt water that these oil companies are able to pump back into the ground is maybe ruining the well. It's not as good a water as it used to be, but in the olden days, Grandpa's driveway was a kind of a roadway to Chandler before they got to county roads and whatnot. There was a trail come up our drive and on back to Grandpa's property toward Chandler, and travelers would stop and get water and water their horses, and the well supplied all that back then. And so it's seen a lot of comings and goings, I guess you'd say.
Well, then what about electricity? Early days.
Yeah. I filled up a mini coal oil lamp. Grandpa signed up for, I guess they called it a co-op, which is now CREC, but he signed up for that way back in the 40s, when I guess they started trying to get it, or maybe even the mid-30s. And he paid his fees, and then when they came through actually starting to put it in, they wanted to charge us again, and Mother says, no, my daddy has already paid for this. And she managed to find the papers somewhere and showed them, and they said, well, yeah, you're right. Okay, so they didn't recharge us for it. And then we got electricity in 1951, and we put us in an electric water pump and got water in the house. And but we never did have an indoor toilet until they built those wood houses in '65, and they had toilet facilities already installed in them, and so Dad put in a septic system and connected them up. But up until '65, it was drink a some water out of the hydrant and go to the outhouse, and electricity in 50, that's when we got our first electric milking, cow milking. They were the little bucket milkers. You sit under next to the cow and just hook the milking cups up to them and milk in 3 or 4 gallons and then dump the bucket. I think the bucket held 5 gallons of milk is what it held. And that was a little faster than hand milking, but you're talking about growing up, you know, it wasn't nothing. In fact, all my life I'd have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and we'd go out and milk anywhere from 13 to 20 head, depending on how many cows were fresh at the time. My throat's getting scratchy. And we'd bring the milk to the house and strain it up in the milk cans, and one of us would separate it, me and my brother, and the other one would go off and feed the hogs while one separated the milk, and then we had to feed the chickens and catch the school bus at 7:30 to come to school. So, and we also ate breakfast in that period of time too. So we would usually get up at 4, and we'd usually be through with chores by around 6 o'clock. Sit down and eat our breakfast, and then get ready for school and catch the school bus at 7:30.
Sure, do you want to tell that story again on tape about?
Yeah. Well, as I said, Grandpa Royer passed away due to the fact that as a dray driver for the Sac and Fox, he had gone to Guthrie to get a load of produce, and he got him a hamburger to eat as he came back home, and he started getting sick. Well, he decided to either go on home to get my doctoring or go back to Guthrie, and since he would rather be at home, he came on to the Sac and Fox and got his doctoring, but he came back home, and it turned out that he had food poisoning, and so he passed away about 3 days after getting back to the Sac and Fox. And that's what happened to him. I don't know what his age was, but it had to have been after 89, because he did make the run, you know, in 89.
What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, the run? I really don't know anything other than what I had already told you.
Thank you.
He went and made the run and came back and got his papers and went and filed his claim. I do have his original papers on the filing the claim and the papers that they gave him as for ownership of the property. Seems like he had to pay something like $5 or something for the paperwork, maybe, I don't know.
Which was a lot in those days.
I'm sorry?
Which was a lot in those days.
Well, yeah, I guess probably so, seeing as how wages were probably only about $1.50 a month for working.
So for the original farm, what were the structures? Barns, and were there any barns?
Yes, Grandpa had but he built, I guess Israel Royer built, and maybe Grandpa Royer, my grandpa, well, they're both my grandpas. One's great grandpa and one's just grandpa. The old brick house, which was already there, and then just a little bit to the south and west of the brick house, there was a good-sized barn with lean-tos on each side, and one was for sheep. Now, Grandpa did raise sheep and shear them for their wool, and he had the other side was for the milk cows and to be stanched up in bad weather and to milk in. And then the center portion had stalls for the horses and storage above for hay. It had a loft in it, and it was again just what they call clapboard building, and it had a shingle roof at the beginning, and then it had tin over it when we moved there. But it was still there when we moved there in '46, and we used it for a while, and then tore it down and built another barn out to the north of the houses, because where it was built, the water just poured down around it. It stayed a constant mud hole, you know, and so, and he had a blacksmith shop where he did his own blacksmithing, and then it had a lean-to side on it where he stored his tractor and Model T pickup, I guess, and but we never ever parked vehicles in there, but we did park our tractor in it, and it stayed on the property for probably into about 55 or so, or early 60s. And there was a smokehouse where they would smoke their meat and hang it for curing, and it was probably the smokehouse portion was probably about 6 by 8, with a enclosure inside that was about 3 by 3, where he would hang his meat, and he'd build a fire below it and let the smoke go up through that enclosure to smoke it and cure it. And then there was also a garage on that, where he mainly kept his Model T pickup, I guess. And of course, the garage portion was gone when we got there. There was just the old cement slab, which was poured, I guess, at the same time he built the sweet potato barn that he had. And as I said, that had I believe it was 100 bins in the thing, and each of them held 100 bushels. And so.
Did he rebuild that when it burned?
No, after it burned, it stayed there. It just is gone. I don't know whether he was so far in debt from building it or what, but because it only existed probably 5 years or something in that neighborhood, and that just like we built a lean-to calf shed, and I must have worked on putting that thing up a good 8 months. We built it out of trees that we had cut down off of the farm out of cottonwood lumber, and then stacked them up crisscross to cure and dry. And that stuff was so hard to drive a nail in that you couldn't hardly get one in it. I don't know the amount of nails that I went through trying to put that thing together. But it took about 6 months to build it, and I had no more than gotten it built when a tornado came through and demolished it. So, in fact, I think there's still some tin laying there today that was out of that shed that just we never did clean up. You know, it wasn't in the way, and so it's still there. And I'm about talked out, unless you have some more questions that you want to.
Well, when you were in high school, did they have 4-H?
Yeah, but I wasn't a 4-H'er. I went to FFA. I was a state farmer when I think I was a senior when I got that award. Yeah, I did a lot in the FFA. I was FFA president of our school for 2 years, and that's why I got the whiteface actually as a project to for that FFA classes. I went to Howard, Kansas. This was in either 50 or 51. I borrowed the money, $1,000. I went up to Howard, Kansas, and bought 3 registered whiteface heifers for $300 a piece. And I thought, man, that's a lot of money. And it was. But I was still raising Berkshire hogs, and I made good money out of my hogs. In fact, they paid for my loan for them heifers. And I had to sell them because I went into the service in 58 after I graduated. I went to Votech down at Okmulgee, which was an extension of OSU. And I graduated in industrial electrical from down there. And when I got out of there and was getting ready to go to service, I had to sell out. And out of those 3 heifers, for the period of time I had them, and I had sold some along the way, I had 32 or 35 head that I sold. So I produced quite a few white-faced cattle during the time that I had them.
Got your money back.
Yeah.
And you were born where and when?
Okay, I was born in 1934 in the southwest corner of that brick house that was out there on that farm. And that was my birthplace. So.
During the Depression.
Yeah. During the Depression.
Well, when we first got here, you were telling us the story about the chief.
The old Indian chief?
Do you want to tell us that again, or do you want to wait for your mother to tell us?
If she doesn't tell it, I'll retell it to you again. You didn't get it before? Or?
We hadn't started recording when you were telling us.
Oh, you hadn't started recording? Well,
but that's your call.
Yeah, you can ask her about it, and if she doesn't tell it, then I'll retell it for you.
Okay.
If you ask her, I'm sure she'll tell it and probably tell it better.
So the farm's been in the family a long time. What's the next 100 years going to hold for it, do you think?
Well, I really don't know. It may not hold too much. I have put it in trust for my son, which lives in Edmond. We are now out of the farming business, I guess, totally, because we manufacture a friend of my son's had an idea for a flexible track for building, and this track is nothing more than a U-shaped bendable piece of material that you put on the ground. I've got some pictures and stuff around somewhere. In fact, I have some samples of the product in the garage. You can shape it into a diameter, a circle down to, I think it's 18 inches. And so you can build columns with it or just whatever you want to do. So it's for strictly making curved walls. And you put a piece on the ground, on the floor, and a piece on the ceiling, and stand either wooden studs or metal studs in between, and then you put up your curved wall in whatever shape you want. The walls in the bombing memorial down in Oklahoma City are made with our product. So that's what we make, if you've ever been there. And it's done real well. So that's mainly what we do. I still go to meetings about 2 to 3 times a month for business and new product meetings of stuff that we're trying to manufacture and whatnot.
So as far as living things, there's nothing else going on the farm right now? No cattle,
no, nothing other than
pecans?
The pecans, and I do have been letting a guy take care of it. He cuts hay on a 60-40 basis and then buys my 40%. That I let him cut it. He gets 60 free and pays for my 40 and takes it, so I don't have to fool with anything there. Pecans really I haven't been able to get out and do my spraying and stuff, And so in about the last 5 years, we've not produced any pecans. A couple of years there just wasn't any, and a couple of years I didn't get any because I didn't spray. And then of course last year we didn't get any because of that ice storm, and I'm not sure about this year yet. When I have good paper shells, I try to gather them, and I do have some natives that I like to gather if they make. Like I say, there just hasn't been any to bother with trying to gather in about the last 6-7 years.
Okay. Well, what structures are still standing? Any?
The only structure that's still standing is the dairy barn that we built in 50, I think we finished it in 53. It's still there. And then I put a concrete block shop on the north end of it in 65, which is still there. And then I built a hay barn, new, and it's not really finished yet, probably never will be. But Dad had a pole hay barn that he put up in, I guess it was 64, because we went to Germany in 65 and they were up. I could look out of the airplane as we left Oklahoma City going to New York, and I could look down and see the reflection of that new tin, so I knew right where our farm was. We weren't so high that I couldn't see it. And so that's still standing. And other than that, I've got a implement shed that I built in, must have been about 71, somewhere in there. It's there. But the old brick house is demolished or pretty well fell down. The well house, which we built in the 51, is still there. And other than that, everything else is gone. Now, Mother has one of these, I forget what they call them. There were houses that the government built for people, and they're a grant type thing. You have to live in them for 5 years, and then they're yours. Davenport and Lincoln County did that, and since she had lost her home, she got them to build her one out there, and she's been in it. This will be the 5th year, so, and that's there, and of course new.
Still on the property.
Yeah, it's on the property.
Well, I was reading through the paperwork that they sent in to the Historical Society when it became a Centennial Farm, and it mentioned that someone was a teacher for the Indian schools.
Teacher for Indian schools.
Yeah, I think that's what it said. Maybe it's great grandmother.
Might have been. That would have probably been over at the Sacking Fox.
Yeah, I think that's what it said.
Now, Mother did have an aunt that was a teacher, but I don't know whether she taught there. That's a question you better ask her.
Ask her. Okay.
Because I'm not real familiar with that.
Okay, we'll ask her. It says, whoever filled this out, it was, she filled it out, so it was her grandmother.
Yeah, I was going to say, it was probably Mother that filled it out.
Yeah, pretty handwriting, too. Okay, do you have any questions? Anything else we need to ask?
Well, nothing that I can think of. As I say, I've probably about covered everything that, we did, you talk about a porch. One of the old sharecrop houses, we moved to the old brick house and put it on the west side, what would have been the back door, and used it for a wooden storage for firewood and as a mud room. And one other thing which I didn't mention, there is a cellar on the place which is still there, and this happened in the 30s, In fact, it was while Dad and Mother were up there living in the 30, about 31. I think he said he went back to work in 32, and he lost his job in 28 or 29, I think 29 maybe. Or maybe it was 30, because they were married and they didn't get married until 30. They had started drilling for oil, and they had a well that was just on the south side of the old brick house, and gas had come out of the well and seeped across the ground and went down in this cellar. And Dad went in there to get a jar of pickles for supper, and he struck a match to look, and of course, being an oil field worker, he seen the flash and immediately knew what had happened, and he covered his face with his hands, and he blew that cellar up. There had been a kind of a storage house, I guess, on top of the cellar, and it had a glass doorknob in it, and it hit the side of that brick house. And you could still see the impression to this day until it burned and fell down, where that doorknob hit the wall of the brick house. And anyway, he had, it set him on fire, and he had a blue and white striped overalls on. And I can't remember which color he said burned out, whichever one is more susceptible to fire if it's got chemical in it, I guess. So it was probably the blue one. But it burned that colored stripe and didn't burn the other one. And he said, I got out of the cellar and rolled on the ground, put my fire out, and then he went to the house. And he tells about he got up there and he said, I couldn't open the door because my hands were burned. And he said, I just kicked it in, and the baby was in the floor playing, which I guess would have been my brother Jack. And the baby was in front of the door, and when he kicked it in, it knocked the baby out of the way, and Mother turned around and says, why don't you watch what the hell you're doing? And you just hurt the baby. And then, of course, when she seen what he was, the shape he was in, then everything changed, She started taking care of him. But when he first come in the house, she was kind of mad for knocking the baby around. And he was about 45 days of recuperating from that explosion. And of course, there was never a house built back over the cellar after that happened. And like I say, we put that old house that they had been living in up there for a mud room and wood storage at that time.
Well, brick houses were unusual for that time period, weren't they?
Yeah, probably so. But this was built for by the government. Now, I always thought that those brick were hauled from Guthrie down here, but I heard Mother say here a while back, see, Davenport had either one or two brick plants, and she said the brick came from Davenport, so I don't know for sure. But they're about the same type brick as this street has in it up here, so they may well have. They're a soft red clay brick. They're not a hard brick at all, but they're hard enough to hold up. That house had solid brick walls. They were laid all one way and then crisscrossed, and then laid all one way and then crisscrossed. And it was 14 inches thick and solid brick. So, I mean, it was cool in the summer and warm in the winter. It wasn't hard to heat at all. And it was pretty doggone tall, probably about 22 or so feet up in the air to the eave of the ridge comb of the house. And spent a lot of cold nights in that place. So, I mean, Dad never did. He sheetrocked the downstairs, living room and kitchen, but the upstairs he never ever finished. And so we'd lay in bed and look up through it had wood shingles on it. You could look through the cracks of the shingles, and see the sky above. Many's been the morning that I woke up when it had come a light dusting snow, and that snow will come through them shingles, and there'd be snow all over our bed. You'd shake the covers to get the snow off, and jump out of bed, grab your clothes, and down the stairs you go by the fire. So you don't have to dress in the cold.
Well, what about the rain? Then the rain would come through?
Surprisingly enough, the rain didn't come through. It ran off. It takes a blowing wind. Now, if the wind was blowing just so, you might get a few dribbles inside, but on the norm, it didn't leak. No.
Parents' room upstairs too, or was it downstairs?
No, it was upstairs. We all slept upstairs, unless you were sick, and then there was a bed downstairs that, like where I was born, in the southwest corner of the house that you could sleep in. The wife and I, after we got married, and would come. I was in the service when we got married, but on furloughs and stuff, a lot of time we would sleep downstairs generally, and the folks would sleep upstairs. So, and of course the bed was in the living room at that time, and many's the time you just sat on the bed and used it for a chair, a loafer lounge. And of course, record keeping, we didn't keep records.
What'd you do for when it's bath time? Did they
Bath time?
Did they have any? Since you didn't have.
Well, in the winter time, of course, back then you didn't really take too many baths, I guess, because of the way the bath time. Now, after we got electricity and running water, Daddy did get, because he put water into the house, and we had a sink downstairs underneath the stairwell, and where we shaved and washed our face and hands, and kept a water bucket for drinking water. And he got one of these old claw bathtubs and put upstairs, and so from about 52 on, we had a bathtub where we could take a bath. But up until that time, it was an old number 3 wash tub in the wintertime set by the wood stove, and you poured a tea kettle of water in and then put some cold water in until you got it where you wanted it. Then you just, if you were small enough, you could sit in the tub. Otherwise, you stood up and just bent over and got your washer all wet and washed yourself off and rinsed off the same way, and then stepped out and dried. And of course, in the summertime, we had a couple of number 3 wash tubs, and we'd fill them up in the early morning because we usually always raised hay. And so we'd fill them up in the morning time and just let the sun heat them. And then when we finished at night, and it was right at dark time, we'd just go out to the well and strip off and jump in them wash tubs, and we'd use one to wash in and then step over in the other one to rinse off the soap and stuff. And of course, the first bather, he rinsed off in the original tub, and then everybody else got to step over into the other tub to rinse off. That way you didn't have to rinse off in the first one's dirt, But, yeah.
Those were some of the good old days, though.
Yeah, I guess. You go out and it usually befell me because I was, not that I'm hard-hearted, it just didn't affect me that much. I go out and grab the rooster by the neck and crank him around until he flew off his head. And when he got through walking around and hopping, I'd go bring him in for Mother to souse in the hot water and defeather. I've done a lot of squirrel hunting and frog hunting. Even brought a few turtles home. when the wife and I was dating, I took some turtle over for her to try because she said she never had eaten turtle. The next time we had a date, I said, "How'd you like that turtle?" "Oh, it was okay." And years later, I found out that, "Oh, I gave it to Daddy." She didn't even try it. You know. But turtle's good. I love turtle. They're just so doggone hard to clean. There was one of the kids brought me one here a while back that I almost cleaned, but no, I ain't gonna do it. It's too much work. It's hard to get that shell off of them. You gotta have a pretty sharp axe or a good knife, and you have to hammer it through between the bottom shell and the top shell. Then you gotta get a wire around his head, pull it out to cut that off too. Otherwise it'd be a snapping at you.
More information than we wanted.
More information than you bargained for, huh?
On that. Okay, shall we quit? Well, we'll close this one off and we'll move forward to your mother's.
Okay.
Thank you for telling us all this morning. It's been fun.